The Cursed Land, Spirits That Never Forgive. In this haunting tale, a retired school teacher, Mr. Ted, purchases a suspiciously cheap plot of land on the outskirts of his village, unaware of its dark history. Over time, he learns of a string of mysterious deaths and tragedies tied to the land, which was once home to a sacred shrine desecrated by its previous owners. His friend Mr. Smith is struggling and in need of a place to live, so Mr. Ted generously offers him the cursed land to build a home. Despite numerous warnings from villagers, including an old woman who claims the land is inhabited by vengeful spirits, Mr. Ted remains skeptical. After moving in, Mr. Smith's family faces a series of horrifying events, starting with eerie sightings and strange accidents. Eventually, one by one, members of his family fall victim to inexplicable deaths or go mad. The tension escalates when Mr. Ted finally confronts the reality of the curse, fearing that his goodwill may have doomed his best friend. With spine-chilling details and an unsettling atmosphere, this story unravels the tragic consequences of ignoring the warnings of the supernatural. Part 1. A generous offer. The sky was a bleak shade of grey that evening, the kind of sky that made you feel like something ominous was just on the horizon, waiting to reveal itself. Ted sat at his kitchen table, staring out the window into the distance, his fingers absently tracing the rim of his cooling cup of tea. The weight of the decision it just made lingered heavily on his mind. The air in the room seemed to thicken with tension, though he couldn't pinpoint why. His wife Mary had long gone to bed, but Ted couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to sit just a bit longer, as if he were waiting for something, or perhaps for nothing at all. Earlier that day, Ted had extended an offer to his old friend Smith, an offer that had seemed, at the time, to be the solution to a problem that weighed heavily on both their minds. Ted was a retired school teacher, well respected in the village, but Smith was not so fortunate. Life had not been kind to him. Years of financial struggle, compounded by a string of misfortunes, had left Smith a shadow of his former self. Once a man with a family and a home, he now found himself staring at the very real possibility of being homeless. Ted had watched Smith's slow descent with increasing unease. They had grown up together, been inseparable during their childhood, and while life had led them on different paths, Ted could never abandon his old friend. He had to help, but what could he offer? Ted was not wealthy, and his retirement funds were just enough to keep him and Mary comfortable. He had no excess to give, except for the land. Ah yes, the land. Ted's eyes drifted toward the window again, his thoughts momentarily drawn back to that curious piece of property he had bought years ago. It was an oddly shaped plot of land situated on the outskirts of the village, beyond the river where the woods began to thicken. It was large enough for a small house and maybe a garden, but nothing more. It had been a bargain dirt cheap for the size. He had thought it would be a good investment for his later years, something he might sell or perhaps build on. But the land had remained empty and untouched ever since he purchased it, as though some invisible force prevented him from doing anything with it. The villagers had whispered about that land, stories passed down for generations of strange occurrences, eerie noises, and unexplainable tragedies tied to it. Ted had laughed it off when he bought it, rolling his eyes at the superstitions of small-town life. Ghost stories, curses, and spirits were for the easily fooled, he thought. Ted was a man of reason and logic, a former teacher who believed in science, not the supernatural. Yet, the whispers had persisted. You'd do well to leave that land alone, Ted, an old villager, had warned him once, eyes clouded with fear. The place holds darkness, a curse from long ago. It's not meant for living men. Ted had chuckled at the old man's words, but now, in the quiet of his home, with only the ticking of the clock to accompany him, a shiver ran down his spine. For a fleeting moment, he wondered if he should have listened. But that was ridiculous, wasn't it? Ted shook his head, brushing away the unease that gnawed at the back of his mind. He wasn't going to give in to such nonsense. He had made his decision, and it was the right one. He would give Smith the land. Smith needed a place to live, and Ted had the means to provide it. What else could he do? Besides, the land was just that land, nothing more. All those years nothing strange had happened to him, and he had been the rightful owner. Surely it would be the same for Smith. Still, a lingering doubt tugged at the corners of Ted's mind as he recalled the expression on Mary's face when he told her of his plan. "Are you sure about this, Ted?" she had asked, her voice tight with worry. "That land. It's been empty for so long. There's something wrong about it. I've heard things that make me think it's not safe." Ted had laughed it off, though her words had left an imprint. "You've been listening to too many of those old stories, Mary. It's just land. Besides, Smith means it more than we do. What harm could it do but the rumors?" "Rumors?" Ted had interrupted, shaking his head. "That's all they are. We're not going to let baseless fears stop us from helping someone in need." Mary had fallen silent, but Ted could see the fear in her eyes. She had grown up in the village, after all, and had likely been exposed to the same stories her whole life. Still, she hadn't protested further, and Ted had pushed ahead with his plan. Now, hours later, Ted sat alone, trying to reassure himself. This was the right thing to do. It was a gift, a lifeline to a man on the brink of losing everything. What was the alternative? Let Smith suffer in silence while Ted sat on a plot of unused land? No, that wasn't something Ted could live with. The wind picked up outside, howling softly as it rattled the window panes. Ted felt an inexplicable chill, even though the room was warm. He sighed deeply, standing up to pour himself another cup of tea, hoping to shake off the strange heaviness that had settled over him. As the kettle whistled, Ted's mind wandered back to the stories he had heard about the land, despite himself. It was said that long ago, a family had once lived there, a family that had met a tragic end. The details were always murky, the facts lost to time, but some claimed the father had gone mad, driven to despair by forces unseen. Others said it was the wife who had succumbed to some evil presence, leading to her death and the disappearance of their children. The property had been abandoned ever since, passed from owner to owner, but never lived on. Ted had dismissed these tales, of course. They were nothing but folklore designed to scare children and keep them away from the woods. He was a rational man, after all, a man of reason. But tonight, for the first time in years, he felt an uncomfortable sensation creep into his thoughts. What if there was some truth to those stories? What if the land really was cursed? A sharp knock at the door shattered Ted's thoughts, jolting him back to reality. He nearly spilled the tea as he hurried to answer it. Opening the door, he found himself face to face with Smith, standing there in the dim porch light, his face pale and drawn. "Smith," Ted greeted, trying to keep his voice steady. "What brings you here at this hour?" Smith stepped inside, his eyes darting nervously around the room. I've been thinking about your offer," Teddy stammered, wringing his hands. "The land. I don't know if I should accept it. People are talking, saying strange things about it. My wife, she's scared." Ted could feel the unease in Smith's voice, but he forced a reassuring smile. "It's just land, Smith. Don't let the village gossip get to you. It will be a good place for you and your family to start fresh. Trust me." Smith hesitated, glancing over his shoulder as though expecting to see something lurking in the shadows outside. "But the stories, Ted, they say the land is cursed. That something terrible happened there. I don't know if it's safe for my family." Ted's smile faltered slightly, but he quickly regained his composure. "Listen, Smith," he said, his voice firm. "I've owned that land for years, and nothing has ever happened. It's just superstition. You and I, we don't believe in that nonsense, do we? You need a home, and I'm offering you one. Don't let fear rob you of this chance." Smith nodded slowly, though the doubt in his eyes remained. He looked down at his feet, swallowing hard before finally speaking. "You're right, Ted. I don't have much choice," though Ted clapped his friend on the shoulder, a sense of relief washing over him. "You'll see, Smith. It'll all work out. This will be good for you." But as Smith left, heading back into the cold night, Ted couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in his gut that something was terribly, terribly wrong. The wind howled louder now, a mournful wail that seemed to echo through the very bones of the house. Ted closed the door, his heart heavy with unease. In the distance, far beyond the village, the land waited, silent and still. For now. Part 2. The Haunted Past. The story of the land Ted had given to Smith was not one that people in the village spoke of lightly. It was whispered about in hushed tones, a shadow that lingered in the minds of the older generation. Those who knew its history, those who had seen the strange and tragic events unfold over the years, had long avoided even going near it. The land had become a place of dread, its name spoken only in fear, if spoken at all. But Ted, ever the skeptic, had never believed in the supernatural. The tales of curses and vengeful spirits were nothing more than folklore to him, the kind of stories designed to scare children and keep them away from dangerous places. Ted was a man of logic, grounded in reality, and he saw the land as nothing more than a stretch of unused earth, one that had come at an incredibly low price. A bargain, he thought at the time, with no consideration for the warnings he had received. Still, the land's history was dark, and it was one that the villagers had not forgotten. Decades before Ted had purchased the property, a family had lived there, a family whose story had become intertwined with the haunting that plagued the land. It had started innocuously enough, with the family, a husband, wife, and 2 small children moving onto the land to build their home. The property was vast, with enough room for a modest house, a garden, and even a small barn for livestock. The husband, Mr. Miller, had been excited about the prospect of building a life there, away from the bustle of the village. He believed the land held promise, a future where his family could grow and prosper. But not long after they had settled in, strange things began to happen. At the far edge of the property, nestled beneath the thick canopy of trees, was a small, ancient shrine. No one knew who had built it or how long it had stood there. The villagers only knew that it had always been there, a place of quiet reverence, forgotten by time but respected nonetheless. The shrine was simple, made of stone, its surface weathered and worn by the elements, with only faint carvings hinting at its once sacred purpose. Offerings were occasionally left by those who remembered its significant small tokens of respect to whatever deity or spirit might still dwell there. But Mr. Miller, in his eagerness to clear the land and make it suitable for his family's needs, saw the shrine as nothing more than an eyesore, an obstacle in the way of his plans. He had no passions for the superstitions of the past, no belief in the old ways that still held sway over the villagers. One afternoon, armed with a sledgehammer and a wheelbarrow, he marched to the shrine and began to demolish it. The first strike of the hammer echoed unnaturally through the trees, a sharp, ringing sound that seemed to carry farther than it should have. The air had grown unnaturally still, and even the birds that normally chirped and sang in the branches above had fallen silent. Miller didn't notice, or if he did, he ignored it. With each swing of the hammer, the stone crumbled and fell until all that remained of the shrine was a pile of rubble at his feet. That night, as the family sat down to dinner, an eerie stillness settled over the house. The wind outside had picked up, howling through the trees with a keening wail that made the walls creak and groan. Mrs. Miller glanced nervously out the window, her hand resting lightly on her son's shoulder as he ate in silence. There was something unsettling in the air, a feeling that something was watching, waiting. It was then that the first of the strange occurrences began. The sound of footsteps echoed through the house, soft but unmistakable. They moved slowly, deliberately, as though someone or something was walking the halls. The family exchanged uneasy glances, but Mr. Miller, ever the practical man, dismissed it as the wind or the house settling. He told them not to worry, that there was nothing to fear. But the footsteps grew louder with each passing night. It wasn't long before other strange phenomena started to occur. Objects moved on their own candles that had been placed on the table would suddenly tip over without explanation. The children began waking up in the middle of the night, crying out that they had seen someone standing at the foot of their beds, a dark figure with hollow eyes staring down at them. Mrs. Miller, too, began to feel uneasy, as though there was a presence in the house, something malevolent and unseen that lingered in the shadows, watching them with a cold, predatory gaze. One evening, as Mr. Miller sat alone in the living room, a chill ran down his spine. The air around him seemed to grow colder, and for a moment he could swear he heard someone whispering his name. He turned quickly, scanning the room, but there was no one there. The whispers continued, growing louder and more insistent until they filled his ears like the hiss of a snake. And then, just as suddenly as they had begun, the whispers stopped. The room was deathly silent. But the silence was worse. It was suffocating, pressing in on him from all sides, as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting. Miller felt a weight settle in his chest, a growing sense of dread that he couldn't shake. He stood abruptly, intending to leave the room, but as he reached the doorway he froze. Standing in the hallway, barely visible in the dim light, was a figure. It was the outline of a person, but its features were indistinct, shrouded in shadow. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, but Miller could feel its eyes on him, watching, waiting. His heart pounded in his chest, the sound of his pulse deafening in his ears. He tried to speak, to demand that the figure reveal itself, but his voice caught in his throat. His body felt paralyzed, as though some invisible force was holding him in place. The figure tilted its head slightly, and though it had no face, Miller felt the cold, burning gaze of its eyes. The air around him grew even colder, and a sickening feeling of dread washed over him. And then, in an instant, the figure was gone. The hallway was empty, the oppressive weight lifted, and Miller staggered back, his legs weak beneath him. After that night, things only grew worse. The children fell ill, their once bright and lively faces going pale and gaunt. Mrs. Miller became increasingly withdrawn, haunted by visions of the dark figure that now seemed to stalk their every move. The house itself seemed to rebel against them, walls cracked, windows shattered without warning, and the very ground beneath their feet seemed to tremble with an unnatural energy. Miller, once a man of reason and logic, found himself unraveling. His dreams were plagued by nightmares of the shrine he had destroyed, of the figure that now haunted him. In his dreams, the shrine would rebuild itself, stone by stone, only to be torn down again in an endless cycle of destruction and renewal. The figure would be there, always watching, its hollow eyes burning with a silent fury. One night, as a violent storm raged outside, the tragedy reached its peak. Miller awoke to find his wife standing at the foot of their bed, her face pale and expressionless. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, as she stared down at him, her lips moving in a soundless whisper. He reached out to her, but she stepped back, her body stiff and unnatural. "Claire," he called out, but she did not respond. Suddenly she turned and walked out of the room, her movements slow and deliberate, as though she were being pulled by some unseen force. Miller leapt out of bed, chasing after her, but as he reached the doorway he stopped dead in his tracks. At the end of the hallway, standing in front of the broken window, was the figure. This time it was clearer, more defined. Its body was that of a woman, draped in a tattered white dress, her long black hair hanging limply over her face. But it was her eyes, those hollow, burning eyes, that filled him with a terror he had never known. Mrs. Miller walked toward the figure, her body rigid, her eyes empty. Miller screamed her name, but it was too late. As she reached the figure, she collapsed, her body crumpling to the floor like a rag doll. By morning, Mrs. Miller was dead. The doctors could find no explanation. Her heart had simply stopped, as though some unseen force had willed her life away. The children too followed shortly after, succumbing to the same strange illness that had withered their young bodies. The house was abandoned after that. No one dared go near it, and the land itself seemed to fall into a state of disrepair, as though it were cursed by the very earth it stood on. The villagers spoke of the Miller family in whispers, warning others to stay far away from the cursed property. It was this land that Ted had purchased years after the tragedy had faded into local legend. He had never believed the stories, dismissing them as nonsense. To him, the land was simply a good deal, a stroke of luck in a world filled with superstition and fear. But now, with Smith and his family moving onto the land, the darkness that had once been forgotten was stirring again. The spirits that had been disturbed were awakening, and the curse that had claimed the Miller family was hungry for more. Part 3. First Signs of Horror. The day Smith and his family moved into the house, the sky hung low with thick, dark clouds. It was early autumn, and the air already had a biting chill that seemed to seep through the thickest layers of clothing. Smith stood outside, watching as his wife, Helen, and their 2 children, Ella and Jack, hurriedly moved boxes inside, trying to settle in before the evening shadows grew longer. The land itself felt cold, not just from the approaching winter, but from something deeper, something that seemed to emanate from the ground, as if the earth held its breath. The house had been empty for years, its windows dark and hollow, like dead eyes staring out at the world. The walls groaned under the weight of time, and the air within seemed stale, untouched by life for far too long. Yet Smith had pushed aside any unease. He was grateful to Ted for offering the land at no cost, a saving grace during a time of financial desperation. He refused to let old village rumors deter him. After all, what choice did he have? That night, as the family sat down for their first meal in their new home, a strange silence fell over the house. Outside, the wind howled, pressing against the windows with unnatural force, as if something in the dark was trying to get in. Inside, the house was unnervingly still. The creaks and groans of the house settling seemed louder than they should be, echoing through the empty rooms like the house was breathing, listening. Helen looked up from her plate, her brow furrowed. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice tight with concern. Smith glanced around, his fork pausing midway to his mouth. "What is it?" "I thought I heard," she trailed off, shaking her head. "Never mind. It's probably just the wind." But it wasn't just the wind. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, strange things began to happen. The first sign came as Smith lay in bed, struggling to fall asleep. The room was freezing, far colder than it should have been. He pulled the blankets tighter around him, but the cold seemed to creep up from the floor, wrapping itself around him like icy fingers. He could hear Helen shifting beside him, her breath coming in shallow, uneasy bursts. Suddenly, a loud slam echoed through the house, causing both Smith and Helen to bolt upright in bed. "What was that?" Helen whispered, her eyes wide with fear. Smith strained his ears, but the house had fallen silent again. "It's probably just a door," he said, though he could feel his heart pounding in his chest. "This place is all door stick, the wind blows them shut. Nothing to worry about." Helen didn't look convinced, but she lay back down, pulling the blankets up to her chin. Smith lay there for a long time, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. He could still feel the weight of the cold pressing in around him, thick and heavy like a presence in the room. Then, in the dead of night, just as he was about to drift off, he heard it, a faint, whispering voice, distant yet unmistakable. Smith ... His eyes snapped open, his heart freezing in his chest. The voice had been so soft, so quiet, he wasn't sure if he'd imagined it. But there it was again, clearer this time, drifting from somewhere in the house. Smith ... The sound seemed to come from all directions at once, weaving through the walls, slipping through the cracks. He shot up, glancing around the room in panic, but there was no one there. Helen was still fast asleep beside him, oblivious. Smith forced himself to get out of bed. He padded down the hallway, his feet sinking into the creaky wooden floorboards. As he passed by Jack and Ella's room, he peeked in, making sure they were both safe. They were sleeping soundly, tucked beneath their blankets, but the eerie feeling persisted. Suddenly a sharp bang echoed from downstairs. It was louder this time, closer. Smith's breath caught in his throat. He grabbed a flashlight from the hall table and made his way down the stairs, each step feeling like it took him deeper into the unknown. The house seemed different at night, its walls closing in, the shadows thick and alive. It was as if the darkness itself had a pulse, and with each throb, the house groaned, sighing like a restless sleeper. When he reached the bottom of the stairs, he found the front door wide open, swinging gently on its hinges. The cold wind blew in from the outside, making the curtains flutter airily in the dim light. Smith stared at the door, his mind racing. He was sure he'd locked it. He walked over, slamming it shut and turning the deadbolt. The click of the lock echoed in the empty house, but it did little to ease the tension coiling in his chest. As he turned to head back upstairs, he froze. From the corner of his eye, he saw a figure standing at the far end of the hallway, near the living room. At first it was just a shadow, but as his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he could see her more clearly. A woman. Her long dark hair hung limply over her shoulders, and she wore a white dress, drenched and clinging to her frail form as if she had been caught in a storm. Smith's breath hitched. He blinked, but the figure didn't move. She stood there, silent, watching him. Who are you?" he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. The woman didn't respond. She simply stood there, her head slightly tilted, her hollow eyes fixed on him. There was something terribly wrong about her, something off. The air around her seemed darker, colder, like a void that sucked the warmth from the room. Smith could feel a bone-deep chill creeping up his spine, rooting him to the spot. Then, without warning, the woman began to move. Slowly at first, her bare feet sliding across the floor without a sound. Smith's heart pounded in his ears as she drew closer, her pale face half obscured by the shadows. Her eyes were fixed on him, empty and hollow, as though she were looking through him, not at him. He couldn't move, couldn't scream. She was only a few feet away now, her cold breath whispering against his skin. And then slam. The door to the living room crashed shut between them, breaking the trance. Smith staggered backward, his heart hammering in his chest. He fumbled for the light switch, his hand shaking violently. When the lights flickered on, the hallway was empty. The woman was gone. Smith stood there, gasping for breath, his mind racing. What had he just seen? A dream? A hallucination? But it had felt so real, so painfully real. His skin was still cold from where her presence had brushed against him. For the rest of the night, sleep eluded him. Every creak, every gust of wind felt like a ghost touch. The darkness seemed thicker, more oppressive, as if the house itself was trying to suffocate him. His mind whirled with possibilities, but none of them made sense. Who was the woman? And why had she appeared to him? The next morning, Smith didn't mention the encounter to Helen or the children. He convinced himself it had just been his imagination, heightened by the stress of the move and the exhaustion from working late into the night. But the sense of unease clung to him like a second skin. As the days passed, things only got worse. Doors began to open and close on their own, sometimes slamming shut with such force that the sound reverberated through the entire house. Cold drafts swept through the rooms, even when every window was closed. At night, the faint sound of footsteps echoed from the attic, though no one ever went up there. Helen started to hear the whispers too. At first she thought it was just her mind playing tricks on her, but soon the voices became undeniable, lingering just out of reach, like someone murmuring her name from the shadows. And then there were the children. Ella was the first to mention the woman. She came to Smith one morning, her face pale, her hands trembling. "Daddy," she whispered, clutching her doll tightly to her chest. "There's a lady in my room. She stands in the corner, and she looks at me when I'm sleeping." Smith's stomach dropped. "What do you mean, a lady? What does she look like?" Ella's eyes filled with tears. "She's all wet, Daddy." Like she came from the river. Smith tried to reassure her, brushing it off as a nightmare, but his heart pounded with fear. Could the woman he'd seen that night still be lingering there? Was she haunting his children now? Things escalated quickly after that. One night, Jack woke up screaming, his voice shrill and panicked, as though he were being attacked. Smith and Helen rushed to his room, only to find him curled up in the corner, his eyes wide with terror. He pointed shakily to the window. "She was there," he sobbed. "She was watching me." Smith felt a surge of cold dread. The figure, the woman, she wasn't just a figment of his imagination. She was real, and she was growing bolder, her presence creeping into every corner of their lives. That night, as the family huddled together in the living room, Trying to make sense of the terror that was consuming them, the whispers returned, louder this time, clearer, and in the center of the room, barely visible in the flickering light of the fireplace, stood the woman, her eyes black and hollow, her wet dress dripping onto the floor. There was no escaping her now. Part 4. The woman in white. The days in the new house passed slowly, the air thick with tension. Smith had begun to feel the weight of the house pressing down on him, a constant, oppressive presence. But for his wife Linda, the horror that lurked in their new home was starting to take a different shape, something far more personal and sinister. It started with the dreams. Linda had always been a light sleeper, often waking at the slightest sound. But lately, her nights were plagued by a deeper restlessness, a sense that she was never truly alone, even in the stillness of their bedroom. The first nightmare came just a few days after they had moved in. She had been lying in bed, the darkness of the room swallowing her whole, when she felt a presence at the foot of the bed. She couldn't move, couldn't even turn her head, as though some invisible force had pinned her down. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat thundering in her ears, and the air around her grew thick and cold. A freezing draft whispered over her skin, sending a shiver down her spine. It was then that she saw her. A woman, dressed in a tattered white dress, her long dark hair wet and clinging to her shoulders, stood at the foot of the bed. Her face was obscured by shadows, but her eyes, those terrible, empty eyes, glowed faintly in the darkness, hollow and cold. She didn't move. She simply stood there, staring down at Linda with an intensity that made her blood run cold. Linda tried to scream, to call out to Smith, but no sound came. She was trapped, frozen in place, as the woman's icy gaze bored into her. The silence in the room was deafening, and Linda could feel her pulse quickening, her breath catching in her throat. The woman began to move, slowly, her bare feet gliding across the floor. The sound was barely audible, like the soft rustle of fabric against wood, but to Linda, it felt as though the entire room was vibrating with her presence. Closer and closer the woman came, until she stood just inches away from Linda's face. Then, without warning, the woman leaned down, her breath cold against Linda's skin. Her lips parted, and she whispered words that Linda couldn't understand, words that seemed to swirl around her in the dark, wrapping her in a suffocating fog of fear. Linda shot up in bed, her heart racing, gasping for air. The room was empty, the silence of the house deafening. She glanced over at Smith, who was fast asleep beside her, completely unaware of the nightmare she had just endured. The dream had felt so real, so vivid, that Linda found herself staring at the foot of the bed, half expecting to see the woman still standing there. But there was nothing. For the next few nights the same dream returned, each time more vivid than the last. The woman's figure became clearer, her face more distinct, though still obscured by shadows. Her presence felt more aggressive, more menacing, and Linda's terror grew with each passing night. The woman wasn't just haunting her dreams, she was haunting her. By the end of the first week, Linda began waking up drenched in sweat, her heart pounding in her chest. The woman in white was no longer confined to her dreams. Linda could feel her, even in the daylight. The corners of the house seemed to pulse with an unseen energy, and every time she passed a darkened room, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching her. But it wasn't just Linda. Their daughter, Emily, had always been a quiet child, often content to play by herself for hours on end. But recently something had changed. Smith had noticed it first, how Emily would sit in the corner of a room, her eyes wide and unblinking, as though she were listening to someone that no one else could hear. Sometimes she would nod, as if answering an invisible question, her lips moving silently as if in conversation. At first Smith had brushed it off as the wild imagination of a child, but it soon became clear that something far more sinister was at play. One afternoon, as Linda was preparing dinner in the kitchen, she overheard Emily talking softly to someone. At first she thought it was just another one of Emily's imaginary games, but when she walked into the living room, her heart stopped. Emily was sitting in the corner, her knees pulled to her chest, her eyes fixed on the empty space in front of her. Her lips were moving, whispering something too quiet for Linda to hear, but it was a look on her face that sent chills down Linda's spine. There was a look of fear in Emily's eyes, her small hands trembling as she whispered to the empty corner of the room. Linda felt her stomach churn with unease. "Emily," she called softly, trying to keep her voice steady. "Who are you talking to?" "Sweetheart." Emily didn't look up. Her eyes remained locked on the corner, her whispers growing more urgent, more frantic. "Emily," Linda repeated, her voice sharper now. "What are you doing?" Slowly, Emily turned her head to look at her mother, her eyes wide and dark, her expression unreadable. For a moment she didn't say anything, just stared at Linda with a look that seemed far too old for her young face. "I'm talking to the lady," Emily said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Linda felt a shiver run down her spine. She crouched down beside Emily, forcing herself to remain calm. "What lady, sweetie?" "The lady in the white dress," Emily replied, her voice so matter-of-fact it made Linda's skin crawl. "She's sad, Mommy. She's very sad." Linda's throat tightened. She glanced toward the corner where Emily had been staring, but there was nothing there, nothing she could see, at least. "What does the lady say to you?" Linda asked, her voice barely steady. Emily looked back toward the corner, her face growing somber. "She says she wants to stay with us. She says she's lonely." The word sent a wave of cold dread through Linda. She grabbed Emily's hand, pulling her to her feet. "You don't need to talk to the lady anymore, okay? There's no lady here. It's just us." Emily didn't argue. She simply nodded and let her mother lead her away, but the unease lingered. The way Emily had spoken, the calm, matter-of-fact tone in her voice was wrong. It didn't sound like a child speaking. It sounded like something far older, far darker. That night, as Linda lay in bed, she couldn't shake the image of Emily sitting in the corner, speaking to the invisible woman. Her heart pounded in her chest as she replayed the conversation in her mind. The words "she's lonely" echoed in her ears, filling her with a growing sense of dread. The nightmares returned that night, more vivid than ever. Linda found herself standing in the middle of the living room, the house silent around her. She could feel the cold air pressing in from all sides, thick and heavy, as if the house itself was holding its breath. In the corner, where Emily had spoken to the invisible woman, the darkness seemed to pulse, shifting and moving as though it were alive. Then, slowly, the woman appeared. She stepped out of the shadows, her white dress flowing behind her, her wet hair hanging limply over her face. This time, Linda could see her more clearly, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow and empty, as if they had been drained of all life. Linda tried to scream, but no sound came. The woman glided toward her, her movements slow and deliberate, as though savoring every step. When she reached Linda, she raised a hand, her cold fingers brushing against Linda's cheek. "You can't get rid of me," the woman whispered, her voice low and filled with sorrow. "I am part of this house." Linda jolted awake, her body drenched in sweat, her heart racing. She could still feel the woman's touch on her skin, cold and clammy, like the touch of death. She glanced around the room, half expecting to see the woman standing at the foot of the bed, but there was nothing, just a silent, suffocating darkness. Beside her, Smith stirred, his eyes flickering open. "What is it?" he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. Linda swallowed hard, her hands trembling as she clutched the blankets to her chest. "It's her," she whispered. "The woman in white. She's real, Smith. She's real." Smith sat up, rubbing his eyes, trying to shake off the remnants of sleep. "What do you mean she's haunting this house?" Linda continued, her voice growing more frantic. "I keep seeing her in my dreams, but it's not just dreams anymore. Emily's been talking to her. She's here, Smith. She's with us." Smith frowned, his face pale in the dim light. "Linda, it's just nightmares. We're both under a lot of stress with the move. Emily has an overactive imagination. There's no woman." "There is a woman," Linda snapped, her voice rising. "I've seen her. Emily has seen her." "This house isn't right. There's something wrong here, Smith. We need to leave." But Smith shook his head, his brow furrowing in frustration. "We can't just leave, Linda. We have nowhere else to go." Linda's heart sank. She knew he was right. They had sunk all their savings into this house, and leaving wasn't an option. But deep down, she knew this was no ordinary house. And the woman in white wasn't going to let them leave easily. The terror that had been lurking just beneath the surface was now fully awake, and it wasn't just haunting Linda's dreams anymore. It was real, and it was coming for them. And as Linda lay back down, her eyes wide open in the dark, she knew with a chilling certainty that they were not alone. The woman in white was there, watching, waiting, and she wasn't going anywhere. Part 5. Seeking help. Smith couldn't take it anymore. The tension in the house had reached a breaking point. The relentless cold drafts, the eerie whispers that echoed through the halls, and worst of all, the woman in white had pushed him to the edge. Linda was becoming more and more unhinged, and Emily had withdrawn completely, speaking only to the invisible figures that seemed to haunt every corner of their home. The feeling of being watched was constant, and no amount of logic or rational thought shake it away. Smith knew something had to be done, and fast. That night, as Linda sat in the corner of the living room, staring blankly into the flickering fire, and Emily played silently by herself, mumbling to her unseen friends, Smith made a decision. There was only one person in the village who might understand what was happening. Agnes. Agnes was old, far older than anyone else in the village. People said she had lived through things no one should live through, that she knew things no one else should know. She had an aura of mystery around her, the kind that made people uneasy in her presence. The villagers often whispered about Agnes, calling her the keeper of old secrets, and while many feared her, they also respected her. Smith had heard the stories how she could speak with the dead, how she had visions of things yet to come, but until now, he had never considered seeking her help. Desperation, however, has a way of changing a man's mind. Early the next morning, with the rising sun casting an eerie, pale light over the village, Smith found himself standing outside Agnes's home. Her house was isolated on the outskirts of the village, nestled deep in a grove of ancient, gnarled trees. The air felt different here, heavier, colder. As Smith approached the weathered wooden door, his footsteps crunched on the gravel path, but it sounded louder than it should have, as if the very ground were amplifying his approach. He hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering over the old brass knocker. Something inside him resisted an instinct that told him he might not want to hear what Agnes had to say. But with a deep breath, he knocked 3 times. The door creaked open almost immediately, as though she had been expecting him. Agnes stood in the doorway, her thin frame draped in a long dark cloak, her face shadowed by the hood that obscured her features. Her eyes, though, were sharp, piercing blue, and they locked onto Smith with unsettling clarity. "I know why you've come," she said, her voice raspy but steady. Smith swallowed, his mouth suddenly dry. "You do?" Agnes nodded slowly, stepping aside to let him in. "The land. It calls for help, doesn't it?" Smith didn't respond right away. Instead, he stepped into the dimly lit house, the scent of herbs and smoke filling his lungs. The walls were lined with shelves, each filled with jars of strange, unidentifiable things, roots, dried flowers, even bones. A large, round table sat in the center of the room, covered with old books and yellow papers. Agnes motioned for him to sit, and he did, the wooden chair creaking under his weight. She moved to the other side of the table, her movements slow but deliberate, as if time itself bent around her. "The land your house sits on," she began, her voice low, almost a whisper. "It's cursed, Mr. Smith. It has been for many, many years." Smith's heart sank. He had heard rumors, of course, but he had always dismissed them as superstitions. "Curse," he repeated, the word tasting bitter in his mouth. Agnes nodded. "Yes, cursed by the spirits of the dead. Long ago, there was a shrine on that land, a sacred place, a resting ground for the spirits who had passed. The people of the village built it to honor them, to keep their souls at peace. But that shrine was desecrated." Smith leaned forward, his pulse quickening. "Desecrated?" How Agnes's eyes darkened. Our family moved onto the land, much like yours. They were careless, disrespectful. The shrine was neglected, its offerings left to rot. One night, in a drunken stupor, the patriarch of the family destroyed it, knocked it over, shattered the stones. He laughed as he did it, mocking the very spirits who had been laid to rest there. She paused, her hands resting on the table, her fingers tracing invisible patterns on the worn wood. The spirits were angered. They had been disturbed, disrespected in the most profound way, and they are not forgiving. Since that day, anyone who has lived on that land has suffered. Smith's skin prickled with cold, suffered how Agnes's eyes met his, and there was a deep sadness there. Tragedy, death, madness. The spirits haunt that place, Mr. Smith. They linger, trapped between this world and the next, seeking revenge for the wrongs done to them. They will not rest until the debt is paid. Smith's breath caught in his throat. He thought of Linda's nightmares, of Emily speaking to invisible figures, of the woman in white who had appeared to him. But why us? We didn't do anything to that shrine. We've tried to respect the land. Agnes shook her head slowly. It doesn't matter. The curse clings to the land itself, not the people who live there. You are simply the latest in a long line of victims. The spirits don't care who you are or what your intentions might be. To them, you are trespassers, intruders on their sacred ground. Smith's mind raced. The weight of Agnes's words pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe. But there must be something we can do, some way to appease them. Agnes sighed, her gaze falling to the table. I wish it were that simple. The spirits are vengeful. They have suffered and they want others to suffer in return. You can try to make peace with them, but Smith's heart pounded. But what? Agnes looked up, her expression grim. But I don't believe they will accept it. They are too far gone, too consumed by their anger. They want revenge, Mr. Smith. And they will stop at nothing to get it. A heavy silence settled between them, the only sound the soft crackle of the fire in the hearth. Smith felt a wave of despair wash over him. He had come here seeking answers, but what he had found was worse than he had feared. The woman in white, the voices, the cold, it wasn't just the house. It was the land. It was cursed and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Agnes must have sensed his despair, because she leaned forward, her voice softer now, almost gentler. There is one thing you might try. Smith looked up, a flicker of hope in his chest. What is it? Agnes hesitated. You could leave. Smith blinked. Leave, she nodded. Abandon the house, abandon the land. Take your family and never return. It's the only way to escape the curse. Smith's heart sank. He thought of money they had spent on the house, the years they had dreamed of a fresh start. Could they really just walk away from it all? I don't know if we can do that, he whispered, his voice trembling. We've put everything we have into this place. Agnes' expression softened. I understand. But you must weigh what is more important, Mr. Smith, your home or your family's safety. Because if you stay, the spirits will not stop. They will torment you until you break. They will take everything from you. Smith's mind reeled. Could he really convince Linda to leave? Could he uproot their lives again with nowhere else to go? And yet, deep down, he knew Agnes was right. The house wasn't just haunted, it was a death sentence. If they stayed, the spirits would consume them one by one. He stood up, his legs shaking beneath him. Thank you, he said, though the words felt hollow. Agnes had given him the truth, but it was a truth he wasn't ready to face. As he left her house and stepped back into the cold morning air, Smith felt the weight of the curse pressing down on him harder than ever. He had come seeking answers, but the only answer was one he couldn't afford to take. The spirits were vengeful, and they were coming for his family, and there was nothing he could do to stop them. The wind howled through the trees as Smith made his way back to the house. Each step felt heavier, as though the very ground beneath him was pulling him back, refusing to let him leave. The shadows stretched long across the road, and the air felt thick with the weight of unseen eyes. When he finally reached the house, he stood at the edge of the property, staring at the dark silhouette of the home against the pale sky. The house loomed before him, its windows dark and lifeless, like empty eyes watching his every move. He knew deep down that the house was waiting. It had always been waiting for him, for Linda, for Emily, and now there was no escape. The spirits were awake, and they would not rest until their revenge was complete. Part 6. Ted's Guilt. The wind howled as Ted sat in his old, creaking armchair, the house around him dim and silent. The evening had settled into a deep, oppressive darkness, and the storm outside mirrored the turmoil within him. For the past few days, Ted had been unable to escape the gnawing sensation that something was horribly, irreversibly wrong. His thoughts kept returning to Smith, his oldest and dearest friend, and to the cursed land that now belonged to him. Ted had brushed off the villagers' warnings when he first bought the land. The whispers of a curse, of vengeful spirits trapped in the earth, seemed like little more than old wives' tales spun to scare children. He had been so sure of himself, so confident that the stories were nothing but superstition. After all, Ted was a man of logic, a retired teacher who had built his life on reason and education. He didn't believe in curses. Not then. But now, doubt clawed at him relentlessly. The strange happenings that Smith had confided to him over the past few weeks, the cold drafts, the doors slamming by themselves, Linda's unsettling dreams of a ghostly woman, and worst of all, Emily's conversations with unseen figures, none of it could be explained away anymore. Ted's rational mind had crumbled under the weight of these eerie events, and a terrible realization began to take root. He had dismissed the warnings, and in doing so, he might have condemned his best friend's family to a fate worse than death. The fire in the hearth crackled, casting long shadows that danced along the walls, but Ted couldn't feel its warmth. His stomach twisted with guilt, making him feel sick. How could he have been so blind? He had practically handed his best friend over to whatever malevolent force haunted that land. Every fiber of his being screamed that he needed to act now, before it was too late. Grabbing his coat, Ted stood abruptly, the legs of his chair scraping against the wooden floor. The guilt weighed on him like a leaden chain as he hurried out into the storm, the icy rain pelting his face. He barely noticed the cold. His only thought was of Smith and his family, and the overwhelming need to help them escape the horrors that surely awaited them. The village roads were deserted, the storm keeping everyone indoors. Ted's boots splashed through the muddy streets, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he made his way towards Smith's house. He had to reach them, had to warn them, to help them get away from that cursed place. He could feel the urgency mounting with every step, as if time itself were slipping away from him. Every second counted. When Ted finally arrived at the edge of Smith's property, he froze, his heart hammering in his chest. The house stood ominously before him, its silhouette a dark, hulking shape against the backdrop of the stormy sky. The wind whipped around him, carrying with it a deep, unsettling silence from the house. No light flickered from the windows. The place seemed devoid of life, as though it had been abandoned by the living long ago. Ted's pulse quickened, dread settling into his bones. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. He moved forward cautiously, his eyes darting across the yard. The once welcoming home now looked like a tomb. The front door was slightly ajar, creaking ever so slightly as the wind nudged it back and forth. The sight of the open door sent a chill down Ted's spine. He swallowed hard, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease gnawing at him. Smith, Ted called out, his voice weak and shaky. The sound was swallowed by the wind. No response came. Ted stepped onto the porch, his hands trembling as he reached for the door. It groaned as he pushed it open, revealing the darkened interior of the house. He stepped inside, the heavy atmosphere wrapping around him like a suffocating fog. The air was thick, damp, and filled with a sense of dread so palpable that Ted could almost taste it. His breath came in short, sharp bursts as his eyes struggled to adjust to the dim light. Smith Ted's voice was louder now, panic creeping in. His feet moved on their own, carrying him deeper into the house. The floorboards groaned under his weight, echoing through the empty halls. A sickening feeling coiled in his stomach as he passed through the living room, his eyes darting around for any sign of his friend. The fire had long since died out, leaving the room cold and lifeless. It was too quiet. Ted's footsteps faltered as he neared the kitchen. There, in the pale glow of the storm outside, he saw something that made his heart drop into his stomach. The table was set for dinner plates, silverware, even glasses of water, but it looked untouched. The chairs were pulled out slightly, as though the family had been about to sit down but never did. There was a chilling stillness to the scene, like the house itself had frozen in time. Ted's throat tightened as a single, horrifying thought passed through his mind. Where was Smith? His hand shook as he made his way to the stairs, the creaking of each step reverberating through the empty house, like the tolling of a bell. A cold draft swept past him, brushing against his skin like icy fingers. Ted shivered, his nerves frayed as he reached the top of the stairs. The hallway stretched before him, dark and foreboding. The shadows seemed thicker here, more oppressive. He could barely see the doors lining the hall, but one of them stood slightly ajar, the door to Emily's room. Ted's heart skipped a beat as he approached the room. His fingers hesitated on the doorknob, every instinct screaming for him to turn back. But he couldn't leave. He had to know. He pushed the door open. The sight that met him was worse than anything he could have imagined. Emily's bed was empty, the sheets tangled and thrown to the floor, as though she had left in a hurry. The walls, which had once been painted a soft pastel color, were now covered in dark, jagged markings, like scratches gouged into the wood. They spiraled around the room, twisting and curling, almost as if they had been carved by someone in a frenzy. And in the corner, standing unnervingly still, was a single doll, its glassy eyes reflecting the faint light from the window. It stared at Ted, its presence unnerving and unnatural. Ted's knees buckled, and he stumbled back, his mind racing with 1,000 questions. Where was Emily? Where was Linda? Where was Smith? Just as panic threatened to consume him, a faint sound reached his ears. A voice, distant but unmistakable, helped me. Ted's blood ran cold. The voice wasn't coming from Emily's room. It was coming from below. Heart pounding, Ted rushed down the stairs, the voice growing louder with each step. It led him to the basement door, which hung slightly open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. Ted hesitated for only a moment before plunging down the steps, his every nerve on edge. The basement was damp and cold, the air heavy with the smell of earth and decay. Ted's breath came in ragged gasps as he reached the bottom, his eyes scanning the room frantically. There, in the far corner, huddled against the wall, was Smith. But something was wrong. Smith was barely recognizable, his body slumped against the cold stone, his face gaunt and pale. His eyes were wide, unblinking, filled with a terror Ted had never seen before. His hands were shaking violently, clutching at something unseen, his lips moving soundlessly. Smith's head rushed forward, grabbing his friend's shoulders, shaking him desperately. What happened? Where's Linda? Where's Emily? Smith's head lolled to the side, his eyes fixing on Ted with a hollow, vacant stare. When he spoke, his voice was little more than a rasp. It's too late, he whispered, his breath coming in short, shallow bursts. There here. Ted's heart lurched in his chest. Hosea Smith's trembling hand pointed weakly toward the far corner of the basement. Ted followed his gaze, his blood turning to ice. In the shadows, barely visible but undeniably there, was the woman in white. Her gaunt figure stood motionless, her black, hollow eyes fixed on Ted. Her wet hair hung limply over her face, and her tattered dress clung to her frail body like a second skin. The air around her was thick with cold, so cold that Ted could feel it sinking into his bones, freezing him in place. He couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. The woman's lips parted, and she whispered softly, her voice echoing in the confined space. You can't save them. Ted's entire body shook with fear as the woman stepped forward, her presence filling the room with a suffocating weight. He could hear Smith muttering under his breath, his voice growing weaker by the second. There's no escape, Smith mumbled. his eyes fluttering shut. No escape, the woman in white was only inches from Ted now, her cold breath brushing against his skin. He could feel the darkness surrounding her, pressing in on him from all sides. She leaned in closer, her empty eyes locking onto his, and Ted knew in that moment that she was right. It was too late. Ted's vision blurred and the world around him began to fade. The last thing he heard before the darkness consumed him was the faint, chilling whisper of the woman in white. They're mine now. Part 7. The Final Visit. Ted stood at the edge of the driveway, staring at the Smith house. The storm had passed, but the sky remained an oppressive, dull grey. Clouds loomed overhead, casting long shadows across the property, as if the sun itself had forsaken this place. The house looked different now, darker, more sinister. The windows were black voids, staring back at him like soulless eyes. The front door was ajar, swinging gently in the breeze, as though it were beckoning him inside. Ted's coat churned with unease. Every instinct screamed at him to turn around, to leave this cursed place and never look back, but he couldn't. Smith was still inside. Ted took a step forward, his feet sinking slightly into the wet earth. The silence around him was unnerving, broken only by the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. He hadn't heard from Smith in days, and that gnawing guilt had only grown heavier in his chest. He had given Smith the land, dismissing the warnings, waving off the stories as nonsense. But now, after everything that had happened, Ted knew the truth. The land wasn't just cursed, it was a prison. And Smith, Linda, and Emily were trapped inside with something far worse than the whispers of a forgotten past. As Ted climbed the porch steps, his heart pounded in his chest. His hands trembled as he pushed the front door open wider. It creaked, the sound sharp and grating against the eerie stillness of the house. The temperature dropped immediately. As he stepped inside, cold air wrapping around him like a suffocating shroud. His breath hung in the air, visible in thin white puffs. Smith, Ted called, his voice hoarse, almost a whisper. The word echoed down the dark hallway, but no answer came. The house was deathly quiet, too quiet. It felt as though it had been abandoned for years, and yet everything was still in place. The furniture sat unmoved, as if waiting for someone to come back. The pictures on the wall stared back at him, family photos of Smith, Linda, and Emily, but there was something wrong with them now. The faces looked distorted, twisted by shadow and light in ways that made them seem less like memories and more like mockeries of the lives they once represented. Ted shivered, his fingers numb from the cold. He moved cautiously through the house, every creak of the floorboards sounding deafening in the oppressive silence. The air was thick, heavy, as though the house itself was alive, watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. His pulse quickened as he reached the living room. The fireplace was cold, the embers long since extinguished. The dining table was set for a meal that had clearly never been eaten. Plates sat untouched, forks and knives neatly arranged beside them, as if the family had been interrupted just before they sat down. A glass of water stood on the table, condensation still clinging to its surface, but no one was there to drink it. Something was terribly wrong. Ted's gaze drifted toward the stairs, where a dark hallway led to the bedrooms. The shadows seemed thicker there, impenetrable, as if they were hiding something. His throat tightened as he started up the stairs, his footsteps slow and deliberate. Every step felt like an eternity, the air growing colder with each one. Smith Ted called again, though this time his voice cracked with fear. He didn't know what he expected to hear. Maybe Smith's voice, weak but alive, calling back from one of the rooms. Maybe the sound of Linda's soft footsteps, or Emily's laughter. But there was nothing, only silence. When Ted reached the top of the stairs, the air was so cold that his breath came in shallow gasps. The hallway stretched out before him like a tunnel, the darkness so thick it seemed almost alive. The door to Emily's room was open, just a crack, the faintest sliver of light spilling into the hallway. Ted's chest tightened as he approached the door, his hand hovering over the handle. Something about the room terrified him in a way he couldn't explain. The air around the door was colder than anywhere else in the house. and there was an almost palpable sense of dread that emanated from within. With a shaky breath, Ted pushed the door open. Emily's room was just as he remembered it, but now it felt wrong. The pale pink walls, the tiny bed covered in stuffed animals, the dolls neatly arranged on the shelf, it all seemed frozen in time, untouched by the chaos that had engulfed the rest of the house. And yet, the room was not empty. Ted's breath caught in his throat as his eyes fell on the figure standing in the corner of the room. It was Emily, or at least it looked like her. She stood facing the wall, her long, dark hair hanging limply over her shoulders. Her dress was torn, her bare feet pale against the wooden floor. But something was off. Her posture was too rigid, too unnatural, and her head hung at an odd angle, as if it were too heavy for her neck to support. "Emily, Ted," whispered, his voice barely audible. The girl didn't move. She just stood there, facing the wall, silent and still. Ted took a step forward, his heart pounding so loudly he thought it might burst from his chest. Emily, this time she moved, but not in the way he expected. Her head jerked to the side, as if someone had pulled it sharply, and for the briefest moment Ted saw her face. Her eyes were wide, hollow, and her mouth hung open in a silent scream. Ted stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat. The cold in the room grew more intense, and a low whisper began to fill the air, like the wind howling through a graveyard. Ted's mind raced, his instincts screaming for him to leave. But he couldn't. He had to find Smith. With shaking hands, Ted backed out of the room, the door closing behind him with a soft click. He turned toward the master bedroom, his legs feeling like lead as he made his way down the hallway. The sense of dread was overwhelming now, pressing down on him like a weight he couldn't escape. Every step felt like it took him deeper into a nightmare. When he reached the bedroom door, Ted hesitated. The air around it was thick with something he couldn't name, something dark and ancient. It felt as though the very walls were holding their breath, waiting for him to make his move. He pushed the door open. The room was cold, unnaturally so, and the stench of decay hit him immediately, making his stomach churn. The bed was unmade, the covers thrown haphazardly to the side, and in the center of the room stood a figure, Smith. But he was wrong, everything about him was wrong. Smith's skin was pale, almost translucent, his eyes sunken deep into his skull. His clothes hung off him like rags, and his hands trembled as he stood there, staring at nothing. His mouth moved, but no sound came out, as if he were trying to speak but had forgotten how. Smith, Ted gasped, rushing forward, grabbing his friend by the shoulders. "Smith, what's happened? Where's Linda? Where's Emily?" Smith's head turned slowly, his eyes locking onto Ted's with a vacant, empty stare. His lips trembled, and for a moment Ted thought he might actually speak. But then, in a voice that was barely a whisper, Smith uttered a single word. Ted's heart stopped. He could feel the darkness closing in around them, the air going colder, thicker. The walls seemed to pulse, as if the house itself were alive, feeding off their fear. He tried to shake Smith to get him to snap out of whatever trance he was in, but it was no use. Smith was lost. The whispering grew louder, filling Ted's ears, and he realized with a sudden, horrifying clarity that they were not alone. The room seemed to twist and warp around them, shadows creeping along the walls like tendrils of smoke. And then, from the corner of his eye, Ted saw her, the woman in white. She stood in the doorway, her hollow eyes fixed on him, her lips curled into a twisted smile. Her tattered dress clung to her skeletal frame, and her long dark hair hung over her face like a shroud. The air around her crackled with a malevolent energy, and Ted could feel her presence, cold and suffocating. "Leave," she whispered, her voice echoing through the room like the wind through a graveyard. "You cannot save him." Ted's breath came in shallow gasps, his mind racing. He had to get out. He had to leave. But Smith, he couldn't just leave him here. Not like this. But as Ted looked into his friend's hollow eyes, he knew it was already too late. The woman in white stepped forward, her cold breath brushing against Ted's skin, and he could feel the darkness closing in around him, suffocating him. He stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest, his mind screaming for him to run. And as he turned to flee, The last thing he saw was Smith, standing motionless in the center of the room, his eyes wide and vacant, as if he had already accepted his fate. Ted ran, the whispers chasing him down the hallway, the house closing in around him. He didn't stop until he was outside, gasping for breath, the cold air stinging his lungs. The house stood silent behind him, its dark windows staring back at him like empty eyes. And in the distance he could still hear the faint whisper of the woman in white. "You cannot save them." Ted collapsed onto the ground, his body trembling with fear. He had failed. Smith, Linda, Emily, they were gone. The house had claimed them, and there was nothing he could do. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the yard, Ted knew one thing for certain: the curse was real. And there was no escaping it. Part 8. The Horrifying Discovery. Ted stood frozen at the threshold of the basement door, his breath shallow and ragged. The dim light from the single bare bulb flickered, casting eerie, elongated shadows on the walls that seemed to move with a life of their own. The cold in the air was unnatural, biting at his skin, sending a tremor deep into his bones. He knew he felt that something unspeakable had happened here. His heart pounded in his chest as he hesitated, dread anchoring his feet to the floor. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a voice screamed at him to turn back, to run from this place and never look back. But he couldn't. Smith was down there. His family was down there, though slowly. With trembling hands, Ted gripped the railing and descended the stairs, each step creaking underfoot like the groaning of an old, dying creature. The oppressive atmosphere of the house only intensified as he went lower, the air growing thicker, more suffocating with every passing second. It felt like wading into the depths of something ancient, something evil, that lurked just beneath the surface, waiting for him to come closer. When Ted reached the bottom, his blood turned to ice. There, huddled together in the far corner of the basement, were Smith, Linda, and Emily, frozen in death. Their bodies were contorted, twisted in unnatural positions, as if they had been trying to crawl away from something or someone. Their faces. Oh God, their faces. Ted stumbled back, bile rising in his throat, as he took in the sheer terror etched into their expressions. Their eyes were wide, still staring at something only they had seen in their final moments. Their mouths hung open in silent screams, their jaws stretched impossibly wide as if they tried to release every ounce of breath, every shred of sanity, in their final moments. It was as if death had not come swiftly, but had taken its time, lingering over them, relishing their fear. Ted's legs trembled, and he nearly collapsed to the ground as the realization hit him with the force of a sledgehammer. He had been too late. The curse had claimed them all. No, the word escaped his lips in a weak, broken whisper, but there was no one to hear it. The basement was silent, save for the faint hum of the flickering bulb overhead. The horror of what he was seeing felt too immense, too overwhelming for his mind to fully comprehend. He moved forward, his body numb with shock, until he was standing just inches away from Smith's body. His old friend, the man who had stood beside him through thick and thin, was now just a lifeless shell, his soul ripped away by something Ted could not and would not understand. His hand trembled as he reached out, gently touching Smith's cold, stiff shoulder. The skin was like ice, and Ted recoiled as if he had been burned. A wave of nausea hit him, and he stumbled backward, his mind racing. What had done this? What kind of force could leave behind such horror, such terror, frozen on their faces? And the air, it was thick, dense, almost oily, like something lingered here, unseen but felt, watching from the shadows with a hunger that made Ted's skin crawl. He turned his gaze to Linda and Emily, their frail bodies locked in the same grotesque expressions of fear. Emily's small hands were wrapped around her mother's leg, as if in her final moments she had reached out for protection, for comfort, only to be met with the same cold terror that had consumed them all. Ted's mind flashed to the stories the villagers had told, the warnings he had foolishly dismissed as superstition. The cursed land, the vengeful spirits, the desecrated shrine that had unleashed something so dark, so malevolent, it had claimed the lives of everyone who dared to trespass. And now here it was, The truth was staring him in the face, and it was far worse than anything he could have ever imagined. The woman in white. He felt her presence before he even saw her. The air grew colder, the flickering bulb above dimming until the basement was bathed in a soft, oppressive gloom. Ted's heart nearly stopped as he turned slowly toward the far corner of the room, and there she was. The woman in white stood just beyond the shadows, her gaunt, skeletal figure barely visible in the faint light. Her long, tattered dress hung loosely from her emaciated frame, and her dark, stringy hair fell over her face, obscuring her features. But Ted didn't need to see her eyes to know that she was looking at him. He could feel her gaze, cold and invasive, piercing through him with the weight of centuries of anger and torment. A low, guttural whisper filled the room, echoing off the walls like a distant, mournful wail. Ted's breath came in shallow gasps as he backed away, his body trembling with fear. The woman's lips curled into a twisted smile, and though her voice was barely above a whisper, it carried with it the weight of 1,000 unspoken horrors. They belonged to me, now Ted's stomach lurched. His legs felt like they might give out at any moment, but he forced himself to stay upright, his eyes locked on the horrifying figure before him. He wanted to run, to flee from this place and never look back, but he was rooted to the spot by a fear so primal, so overwhelming, that he couldn't move. The woman took a step forward, her movement slow and deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. The air around her seemed to ripple, distorting the very space she moved through, as if reality itself bent to her will. Ted could feel the weight of her presence bearing down on him, a crushing, suffocating force that made it hard to breathe. While Ted choked out, his voice barely a whisper. His throat was dry, and his heart pounded so violently he thought it might burst from his chest. "Why did you take them?" The woman's smile widened, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth that gleamed in the dim light. She tilted her head to the side, her hair falling away to reveal her hollow, sunken eyes black, empty voids that seemed to swallow the light around them. "They desecrated my shrine," she hissed, her voice dripping with malice. "They woke me from my slumber. And now they are mine." Ted's chest tightened as the weight of her words sank in. The desecration, the shrine. It had all started with that, and now Smith and his family had paid the ultimate price for something they hadn't even understood. His stomach churned as guilt washed over him. This was his fault. He had ignored the warnings, dismissed the stories, and now his best friend, his family, was gone. A sob escaped Ted's lips as the woman took another step forward, her movements fluid and inhuman. The darkness around her seemed to pulse, growing thicker, more oppressive with each passing second. Ted backed up until his back hit the cold stone wall, his body trembling uncontrollably. "You should not have come here," the woman whispered, her voice a soft, sinister croon. "But now that you have, you will stay." Ted's eyes widened in terror. He could feel the cold closing in around him, wrapping around his throat like invisible hands, squeezing the life out of him. His breath came in shallow, panicked gasps, and his vision blurred as the world around him began to fade. The woman in white reached out, her bony hand extending toward him, her fingers like claws. The air grew colder still, and Ted's heart pounded in his chest, each beat a frantic, desperate prayer for escape. But there was no escape. The last thing Ted saw before the darkness consumed him was the woman's twisted smile, her hollow eyes gleaming with malice. And then everything went black. When Ted awoke, he was no longer in the basement. The cold stone floor had been replaced by soft earth, the oppressive walls by the open sky. But the chill remained, a deep, bone-numbing cold that seeped into his very soul. He was lying in the middle of the field where the shrine had once stood. The sky above was a deep, inky black, and the wind howled through the trees like the mournful cries of the dead. Ted's body yacked, and his limbs felt heavy, as if he had been drained of all strength. He sat up slowly, his heart pounding in his chest as he looked around. There was no sign of the house, no sign of Smith or his family, but the oppressive feeling of the curse lingered, hanging over him like a dark cloud. Ted's hands trembled as he stood, his mind racing. He had to leave. He had to get out of here before the curse claimed him too. But as he took a step forward, something cold and sharp closed around his ankle. Ted looked down, his breath catching in his throat. A hand, pale and skeletal, was reaching out from the ground, gripping his leg with an iron-like grip, and from the darkness he heard her voice again, soft and sinister. "You belong to me now," Ted screamed, but there was no one left to hear. Part 9. The curse lives on. Ted stumbled through the front yard of the house, his legs heavy with exhaustion and terror. His breath came in ragged gasps, each one fighting against the thick, oppressive air that clung to him like a wet shroud. His heart raced, his pulse thundering in his ears. The sun had set long ago, and now the shadows seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally, as if they had a life of their own, reaching out with dark tendrils to pull him back into the abyss he had just escaped. He had to leave. He had to get out before it was too late. The wind began to pick up, swirling around him with a violent force, tugging at his clothes and sending shivers down his spine. The trees groaned and swayed as if they, too, were alive, mournful sentinels that had witnessed countless horrors in the cursed land beneath their roots. A low, eerie laughter echoed through the branches, faint at first but growing louder, more distinct. It was the sound of something old, something malicious. Ted froze in his tracks. The laughter, it was the same chilling sound he had heard in the basement, the same voice that had whispered those haunting words, "They belong to me," now thought. His stomach lurched, and for a moment his body refused to move, paralyzed by the crushing realization that he was not free. The woman in white, the malevolent presence that had claimed Smith and his family, wasn't done with him. The curse had not ended. It was still alive, still hungry. Ted's skin prickled with the sensation of being watched. He turned slowly, his eyes scanning the darkened landscape. The house loomed behind him like a massive, decaying beast, its windows blackened and hollow. It was as if the very structure itself was a living thing, breathing and waiting for the next poor soul to walk through its doors. Suddenly the front door slammed shut with a deafening bang, the sound reverberating through the air like a gunshot. Ted jumped, his heart nearly leaping out of his chest. The laughter grew louder, more mocking, carried on the wind like the echo of long-forgotten voices. He forced himself to keep moving, stumbling through the overgrown grass, his legs trembling with fear and fatigue. "Don't look back," Ted thought he had to remind himself, over and over again. "Don't look back, Dot." But he did, and what he saw made his blood run cold. At the edge of the property, standing just beyond the line of twisted, gnarled trees, was a figure. It was a woman, draped in white, her long, dark hair flowing unnaturally in the wind. She stood perfectly still, but there was something deeply wrong about her presence, something that made Ted's skin crawl. Her face was obscured by shadows, but he didn't need to see it. He knew it was her, the woman in white. His breath hitched in his throat, his hands trembling uncontrollably. Ted tried to force himself to look away, but he couldn't. His gaze was locked on her, and the air around him seemed to grow colder, the wind howling like the cries of the damned. For a brief, horrifying moment, her eyes met his, hollow, empty, hungry. Ted's body jerked violently, as if an invisible force had shoved him. He stumbled backward, nearly falling to the ground as the oppressive darkness seemed to close in around him, suffocating him with its malevolent presence. The laughter rang out again, louder, sharper, like nails scraping against his mind. "You will never leave," the voice whispered, soft but filled with cruel delight. He turned and ran, his heart pounding in his chest like a drumbeat of panic. His feet tore through the wet grass, each step feeling heavier than the last, as if the land itself was trying to pull him back. The trees loomed above him, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal hands, and the wind howled in his ears, carrying with it the faint whispers of the dead. Ted's mind was racing, his thoughts a chaotic whirl of fear and guilt. The weight of what he had unleashed, of what had been done, crashed down on him with terrifying clarity. This was not just a haunting. This was something far older, far darker, a curse born from the land itself, a hunger that could never be sated, He should have listened what the villagers had warned him. Agnes, the elder, had told him about the spirits, about the shrine, about the vengeful dead that still roamed this forsaken ground. But he had dismissed it all as superstition, as the ramblings of a town too steeped in its own folklore. Now, the truth was laid bare before him, and it was worse than he had ever imagined. The house wasn't just haunted, it was a gateway, a conduit for something beyond the realm of the living. The woman in white was not some lost soul seeking peace. She was something much more sinister. She was the embodiment of the cursed dot, and the land, with all its dark history, was her domain. Ted finally reached the edge of the property, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His legs ached, his lungs burned, but he didn't stop. He crossed the boundary line, his heart hammering against his ribcage. For a moment he felt a flicker of hope, a fleeting sense of escape. But then the wind picked up again, violent and sharp, like a blade slicing through the night. The trees groaned, their branches bending unnaturally, and the ground beneath his feet trembled. A deep, guttural sound rose from the earth, a low, throbbing pulse, as if the land itself was alive. Angry, Ted spun around, just in time to see the woman in white standing at the threshold of the property, her hollow eyes locked onto his. The air around her shimmered with darkness, and her mouth twisted into a cruel, twisted smile. She wasn't coming after him, though she didn't need to. Ted's stomach dropped as the realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He may have crossed the physical boundary of the property, but the curse wasn't bound by fences or landlines. It was something far deeper, far more ingrained in the fabric of this place. And once it had you, there was no leaving. The eerie laughter echoed through the trees again, louder this time, more triumphant. The wind swirled around Ted, cold and biting, as if the very air itself was mocking him. You thought you could leave, the voice whispered, barely audible over the howling wind. But the curse. Leaves on Ted stumbled backward, the weight of the truth crashing down on him with brutal finality. This wasn't over, it would never be over. The spirits of the land, the vengeful dead that had been disturbed by the desecration of their shrine, would continue to claim anyone who dared to set foot here. They would never rest, and now neither would he. The wind howled through the trees as Ted turned and ran, his heart pounding in his chest. The laughter followed him, chasing him through the night like a relentless predator, its icy fingers wrapping around his soul. And somewhere, deep within the twisted, cursed land he had fled, the woman in white watched him go, her hollow eyes gleaming with dark satisfaction. She had claimed the smiths, she had claimed the land. And now she had claimed Ted's soul. As Ted disappeared into the night, his footsteps fading into the distance, the land fell silent once more. But the curse, it waited. It lingered in the air, in the soil, in the very bones of the earth, waiting for the next unwitting soul to stumble across his threshold. And when they did, the woman in white would be there waiting. Because the curse, as Ted now knew all too well, would never die. It lived on, and it would continue to live on for as long as there were those foolish enough to ignore the warnings, to dismiss the stories as mere superstition. For as long as there were those who dared to disturb the dead, the curse would live on, forever.